Picture this. 1,000 years ago, fierce Nordic warriors crossed treacherous seas to reach a continent that had been isolated for 12,000 years. They came seeking new lands, riches, and glory, but something went terribly wrong. Within just a few short years, these legendary Vikings vanished from North America as mysteriously as they had arrived, leaving behind only whispers of violent encounters with the indigenous peoples they called Scrawlings. What really happened during those fateful years when two vastly different worlds collided? Why did the Vikings, who had successfully conquered much of Europe, fail so dramatically in the Americas? Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating mysteries to uncover the truth about the Viking expeditions to North America and their explosive encounters with Native American tribes. The year was 1000 A4. Nearly 12 millennia, the Americas had developed in complete isolation from European civilizations. Two worlds existed without knowing the other was there. But all of that was about to change when Norse explorers would become the first Europeans to set foot on American soil, nearly 500 years before Columbus ever sailed the ocean blue. Our story begins with a man named Eric the Red, a wild and violent Viking who had been banished from Iceland for 3 years after killing someone in a dispute. During his exile, Eric explored and settled a harsh, icy landmass that he cleverly named Greenland to entice others to join him. His marketing strategy worked, and soon thousands of Vikings had made Greenland their new home. It was Eric's son, Leif Erikson, who would become the first confirmed European to reach North America. After hearing tales from a merchant sailor who had been blown off course and spotted mysterious lands to the west, Leif assembled a crew of 35 men and set sail into the unknown around 1000 A.D. When Leif and his men finally reached what we now believe to be Newfoundland, they established a temporary camp. The land was rich and fertile, with wild berries that allegedly got Leif's foster father, Tyker, so intoxicated from fermented cranberries or gooseberries that the Vikings would later name the region Vinland, meaning wineland. But Leif's expedition was brief and peaceful. There are no recorded encounters with Native Americans during this first visit. However, the relative peace wouldn't last long. The Vikings had already encountered indigenous peoples in Greenland, where they traded with the Thule ancestors of the Inuit. Archaeological evidence shows ivory carvings of Norsemen found at Thule sites, along with iron and bronze tools that the Thule couldn't manufacture themselves. The Vikings called these indigenous peoples Scrawlings, likely derived from the Old Norse word meaning dried skin, referring to the animal pelts they wore. A few years after Leif's return to Greenland, his brother Thorvald organized a second expedition to North America. This is where our story takes a dark and violent turn. Thorvald and his men returned to Leif's abandoned camp and decided to stay the winter. But in the spring, everything changed when they encountered 9 Native Americans sleeping under skin-covered canoes. What happened next would set the tone for all future Viking-Native American relations. The Vikings attacked without provocation, killing 8 of the 9 natives. The sole survivor escaped and returned with reinforcements, leading to a fierce battle. In this confrontation, Thorvald was struck by an arrow and became the first recorded European to die in combat with Native Americans. Despite their leader's death, the surviving Vikings remained another winter before finally returning to Greenland. But the most ambitious and ultimately tragic Viking expedition to North America was yet to come. A few years later, a wealthy merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni organized the largest Norse expedition to the New World. Unlike the previous small scouting parties, Thorfinn brought between 160 to 250 men and women across 3 ships, along with livestock, including cattle. This wasn't just an exploration. It was an attempt at permanent colonization. Thorfinn's expedition ventured farther south than any previous Viking journey, establishing a settlement they called Straumford. Initially, relations with the local Native Americans began peacefully enough. The 2 groups engaged in trade, with the indigenous peoples exchanging furs for red cloth, and what the sagas describe as a wondrous liquid called milk that came from the Vikings' cattle. But this peaceful coexistence was fragile and short-lived. The Viking colonists lived on a knife's edge with the native peoples, and there were increasing instances of hostility and violence. The tension reached a breaking point when, according to one account, a bull from the Viking camp broke loose and terrified a group of Native Americans. They fled in panic, but returned in much greater numbers, ready for war. What followed was a legendary battle that would effectively end Viking ambitions in North America. The Native Americans attacked with what the sagas describe as catapults, and a fierce fight ensued. This battle proved to be the last straw for Thorfinn and his colonists. Realizing they were outnumbered and facing determined resistance, they abandoned their settlement and returned to Greenland. No European would attempt to settle in North America again for hundreds of years. The archaeological evidence for these Viking expeditions is remarkably sparse, which adds to the mystery surrounding their brief presence in the Americas. The most significant find is Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered in the 1960s by Norwegian archaeologists Helge and Anstein Ingsted. This site has become the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America. Lanso Meadows contains the remains of 8 sod houses, evidence of ironwork that Native Americans couldn't have performed, and a boat-building frame. Experts believe the site may have served as a ship repair center, perfectly positioned for voyages across the North Atlantic to Greenland. A small bronze pin found at the site, used to fasten cloaks, is definitively Viking in origin and has been dated to between 920 and 1050 A.D. The only other significant piece of physical evidence was discovered much farther south in Maine. In 1957, an amateur archaeologist found what initially appeared to be a medieval British penny on a beach in Brooklyn, Maine. However, experts later identified it as a Norse coin minted between 1065 and 1093. The site where the coin was found, called the Goddard site, also contains numerous arrowheads, leading some to speculate that Vikings may have introduced archery to local Native American tribes. The sagas that tell us about these expeditions, the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, were written down centuries after the events they describe. They mention 3 main locations: Helluland, meaning land of flat stones, Markland, meaning land of forest, and Vinland, meaning land of wine. While scholars have proposed various locations for these places, their exact whereabouts remain a mystery. But perhaps the greatest mystery of all is why the Vikings didn't stay. Why couldn't these fierce warriors, who had successfully raided and settled across Europe, establish permanent colonies in the resource-rich Americas? Several factors likely contributed to their failure. First, the Vikings were severely outnumbered. While they brought superior metal weapons and tools, the Native Americans had the advantage of numbers, local knowledge, and unified resistance to the foreign invaders. The indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated societies over thousands of years and weren't about to be easily displaced. Second, the Vikings may have simply been too few and too far from home. Their supply lines stretched across the dangerous North Atlantic, making reinforcement and resupply extremely difficult. When faced with determined resistance, retreat became the only viable option. Third, climate change played a crucial role in ending Viking expansion. During the 11th century, when these expeditions took place, the world was experiencing what's known as the medieval warm period. Warmer temperatures meant less sea ice and easier ocean travel. But starting in the 12th century, the climate began to cool dramatically during what became known as the Little Ice Age. This cooling period made sea routes increasingly impassable and life in Greenland and Iceland extremely difficult. Evidence points to food shortages and plague devastating Viking populations. Between 1250 and 1700, Iceland's population plummeted from 150,000 to just 50,000. The Vikings were fighting for survival in their existing settlements and had no resources to spare for distant American colonies. The psychological impact of their violent encounters with Native Americans cannot be understated either. The Vikings were accustomed to raiding defenseless monasteries and settlements in Europe, not facing organized resistance from warrior cultures. The realization that the Americas were populated by peoples willing and able to fight back effectively must have been a sobering revelation. The failure of Viking colonization in North America represents one of history's great what-ifs. Had they succeeded in establishing permanent settlements, the entire course of American and world history would have been dramatically different. Instead of Spanish conquistadors arriving in the 16th century, it might have been Norse descendants who encountered the great civilizations of Central and South America. The Vikings' brief stint in North America lasted only a few years, but it represents humanity's first recorded contact between the Old and New Worlds. The violent nature of many of these encounters foreshadowed the tragic conflicts that would follow when Europeans returned to the Americas centuries later. What we know about the Viking expeditions comes primarily from sagas that blend historical fact with mythological elements, making it difficult to separate truth from legend. The physical evidence is limited to one small settlement, a bronze pin, and a single coin. Yet this sparse evidence tells an incredible story of exploration, cultural collision, and ultimately failure. The Vikings who battled Native Americans in North America learned a harsh lesson about the limits of military might when facing determined resistance on foreign soil. Their withdrawal marked the end of the first chapter of European contact with the Americas, but it would not be the last. When Europeans returned nearly 500 years later, they would bring diseases, superior weapons, and overwhelming numbers that the indigenous peoples could not resist. The Viking experience in North America serves as a fascinating preview of the cultural clashes that would define the next millennium of American history. It reminds us that the encounter between Europeans and Native Americans began not with Columbus, but with Norse warriors who discovered that conquest in the New World would be far more challenging than anything they had experienced in Europe.